Equal justice under the law seems to be a waning concept for more than a third of Americans because, you see, a Gallup poll released earlier this year revealed that only 35% of Americans still have confidence that the judicial system is a universal signal and structure for everyone. This represents a 24-point drop over the last 4 years. Gallup says that confidence in the nation's highest court is split between party lines. It found that 71% of Republicans trust their direction and strategic outlook for the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, just 24% of Democrats hold that same opinion. The statistical data is all interesting food for thought for my friend Christine Ohenewah to consider. She's an expert in law, gender, and human behavior. She offers a unique lens at the intersection of law, human behavior, and masculinity. Studies her mens rea framework, makes complex ideas about identity, law, masculinity, and personal development and engagement accessible for everyone. She's got a background as a corporate lawyer who's now transitioned to become a legal educator. She earned her Juris Doctor from Cornell Law School and holds an advanced degree in sociology and international relations from Columbia and the University of Chicago. She's also studied at Oxford and Harvard, respectively, and she also has a degree in political science. In her judgment, defending the highest potential of others has always been at the essence and heart of being a lawyer. And she joined me this week to have a conversation about the evolution of legal rights, education, and how understanding your legal rights can help you ensure a more prosperous future. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. Christine, if you're ready, I'll take a moment to welcome you to the program. And I'm super excited to learn about your career advancing law forward. Great to see you and happy Wednesday to you, my friend.
Oh, thank you, Kevin. Happy Wednesday to you too. And I'm excited to be on.
Absolutely. So, Christine, I'm curious to start a conversation by asking you about how you define legal sort of inclusivity. And what I mean by that is, how do we make the legal system more equitable so that those that are traditionally disadvantaged by the legal system feel that the gap of sort of equality and equity is closing? I'm curious to get your thoughts there, my friend.
Yes, no, what a very profound question, because honestly, in my own observation, right, I think that the law is inherently humanistic, right? If you apply a sociological lens to the law, you will see that ultimately the law is a set of rules agreed upon, right? So it involves, an agreement of the collective conscience, right? And so everyone coming together and saying, this is what we define as moral. This is what we define as good, as bad. These are the rules of governance that we abide by. And so remembering that ultimately the human lies at the center of the law, I think, is the first step in advancing law as an equitable vehicle, right? I fundamentally believe that we have to recognize the law as humanistic because it already is, right? That leap is not hard to make. But however, what has happened, right, per your question, what has happened over time is that we've seen, more and more communities receive less and less access to the law.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
one of the ways that you're helping to try to close that gap, my friend, I know that you're involved in the Elizabeth Twinnable Foundation, which aims to be a new type of educational institution, one that not only teaches individuals about the understanding about their power, but also encourages them to think strategically and build aligned with the potential, my friend. So tell me about the foundation, your involvement in it, and what you want people to know, my friend.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have founded the Elizabeth Chinabua Foundation, and I actually founded it just this summer in July of 2025. And when I started it, the goal, right, was to humanize the law and ultimately, help use the law as a tool that could help others feel seen. And as we developed a little more, I had a moment where I'm like, wait, I actually want to develop this into an educational model where we are using legal principles and applying these legal principles to everyday life scenarios, right, as a means of equipping people to reclaim and to recognize their power accordingly. So that looks like, applying criminal law principles, tort law principles, right, business law principles, and analogizing that to everyday life scenarios so that people are equipped to actually think like lawyers in their own sense, but they're thinking like lawyers for the benefit of their own advancement. So we're democratizing legal knowledge in a sense, in a way that becomes more accessible and helps people attain more equity in their own lives, right? And so what the Elizabeth Chinabua Foundation is doing ultimately, what our goal is, what our ethos is that we are building creators over consumers, right? We are developing the next generation of academia where our students will walk away equipped to, like you said, design lives aligned with their own potential. So what does this actually look like in practice, right? It means not being passive with knowledge, right? Making sure that knowledge is applied in everyday life. And we're encouraging students ultimately to be a bit entrepreneurial, right? And so to create opportunities for themselves, to be able to approach, the world beyond them with a new lens that solidifies and reassures their power. So that would look like having the confidence to build a new business, to build a new institution, to create their own intellectual frameworks, to write a book, right? To create a jigsaw puzzle. It could look like any one of these things. And yes, it starts with, sharing this legal knowledge, right? Most people think that, if you have a law degree, right, you should aim for law practice, traditional law practice. And I would say, I actually don't see it that way. As a former corporate lawyer, I was in criminal defense law and I had a really great time. But I realized, listen, there are so many ways to use the law. There are so many ways in which it comes up. And the way I'm practicing law now is through education, right? And to once again form the next generation of education where people feel like they are just equipped to tackle anything ahead of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I ask you about your pivot to legal education further, I'm also curious to ask you about how we return to a more legal common ground. And I'll give you some context to my question. Watching sort of some of the right-leaning rulings in the Supreme Court that have become a tinge political rather than legal has been concerned a little bit about the state of the judicial system in America today. So how do you think we can return back to sort of a legal common ground? Returning to my question earlier about equity, to make sure that the nation's highest court in America is applying the law of the land instead of the political pressure of the moment. I'm curious to get your thoughts there, my friend.
Yeah, no. Once again, a really important question. And what I would say to that is that one thing we have to remember about the law is that it is fundamentally arbitrary. Actually, if you really think about it, it is all made up, right? This goes back to what I said about, collective consciousness of society. Laws are ever changing, right? They change throughout any historical moment. And when we recognize that, maybe we might not be as surprised when we're seeing, the kind of upheavals that we are witnessing currently, right? Laws can be built over a lifetime and they could collapse overnight, right? Obviously, we have a separation of powers in our government, right? The differences between the executive branch, the judicial branch, the legislative branch, and that has been established to ultimately implement right checks and balances. But when you really get down to the bottom of it and you recognize that, once again, depending on who's in power, that these laws are ever shifting. Yes, we have precedent, and precedent is slow to build and slow to develop. You might also be more willing to accept that times change, times are changing. And so in terms of finding our way back to a common ground, it really depends on us, we the people, and what we the people determine as fair and equitable for everyone. But I think with that in mind, when we're thinking about democracies and how it actually plays out, we have to ask ourselves, do we legitimately have a democracy? Have we ever had a democracy? Or do we rather have what is called, a few elite determined few, right? Who are, committed to forming a new nexus of power and governance. And they've defined it so well that what they've done is to get everyone else to agree with that structure of power and governance, right? So I say all of this to say that power is ever shifting, and it just depends on who wants it the most, right? And so, where laws are concerned, it ultimately depends on who is most determined to define what our society should look like. And if we think of it that way, then we lead to more agency, more autonomy that human beings might seize for themselves. But until then, I think we have to recognize that human beings often forgo their power and delegate their power when they are looking to be governed by other entities rather than by themselves. And so, the question becomes, do we all want to be a unified front? Is it possible to have a unified front? And I would say it is possible, but then we have to ask, for whom and by whom, if any of that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one follow-up to that. I'm curious to ask you whether you think there should be term limits on things like the Supreme Court or any other lifetime judicial sort of appointment. And whether you think we should rethink the way that we appoint justices to the Supreme Court to ensure more balance. I know that there's been a talk about possibly hacking the Supreme Court depending on who's in office, and certainly the concept of term limits have come up. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on the need to really look at the Supreme Court as a whole, and whether you think there should be, guardrails in terms of limits on how long justices are allowed to serve, my friend.
Yeah, no, again, very, very important. And I speak as a millennial here when I say this. I think it never hurts, right, to have more fresh blood.
No
You know,
kidding.
yeah, right. I don't think it hurts, for younger people to occupy these judicial seats, even political seats. And in terms of term limits, I know there's like really long appointed lifetime term limits. And yeah, I once again, incorporating different perspectives, it never hurts, right? It never hurts to have, because we need to be able to have adequate representation for different contingencies in society. And when we are not selecting for people who've come from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds or diverse cultural backgrounds, right, or intellectual backgrounds, we tend to create a silo, and that's how laws once again become determined and maintained by a very elite determined few, rather than being representative of the society as a whole. And so can we capture that with 9 justices? I don't know. I don't know. I'm sure they're doing their best, right? But I once again, we need to determine, well, who do we want in those seats? Who should they look like? Who should they sound like? Right? And once we start asking those questions, then we have to ask, well, once again, for whom, by whom, right? I might sit here and think, oh, yes, of course, we should have more Black women on the Supreme Court. But here's the problem with that. If all of those Black women attended Harvard and Yale and Cornell, right, and UPenn, is that actually, diverse representation? Right? Or are we just getting more of the same type of mentality, type of intellectual thought, right? And should they all be lawyers? That's another thing. I mean, obviously, it makes sense that they would be lawyers, right? But as we've seen in the executive branch, right, most of our presidents have been lawyers until very recently, right? It hasn't been typical to have non-lawyers in the past several decades. And so, something can be said for how we diversify who needs to occupy those seats, right? Do we want a young man from Baltimore, right, making 30K a year, having a go at some of these seats? Or do we want, once again, an older woman who comes from, a very prestigious background, occupying these seats? It's ever fluctuating, and it really depends. And we have to ask, who's agreeing to this? Who's making these decisions? Because I can tell you, in my own classes, in my own courses, um, students feel that gap. They feel disconnected from these laws. I've spent an entire semester asking them, what they imagine the law to be, right? And the first thing that comes to their minds is justice. It should be just. And then I have to be the one to break the bubble and say, actually, the relationship between law and justice couldn't be any further. Most people assume that law and justice should be one and the same. And I would say that if you understand how laws are actually written, interpreted, and upheld, oftentimes it becomes incompatible with justice. So really, to answer your questions, it boils down to, how much do we want as a society, right? Like how much do we want things to be different? And are we willing to be the ones to forge a new kind of governance, or are we going to delegate that decision making to the same few people every few or so years? These are tough questions, and we need to look in the mirror.
Well, there's nothing wrong with having a little diversity of perspective to represent all citizenry. I'm sure you would agree with that, right?
You're right. No, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. And Christine, I know that you have educational training from Cornell Law. You've also spent some time at Columbia and the University of Chicago. So no one will ever accuse you of not being educationally ambitious, okay?
Thank you. I appreciate that, Kevin.
You're welcome, and I know, as you mentioned a couple of times, you now teach, my friend, at both Hofstra and Iona universities, and I know that your work and teachings applied to criminal tort, as you mentioned before, and contract law to everyday questions of power, my friend, and relationships. So tell me about the empowerment you get from teaching and what you get out of it, my friend. I'm fascinated.
Yes, no, I feel like I'm at the point in my life, Kevin, where finally my degrees are converging and making sense all together, right? Um, yeah, no, so I obtained my JD from Cornell Law. I obtained my master's in sociology from Columbia University. I obtained my master's in international relations from the University of Chicago, and then I majored in political science and American studies at Macalester College. Right, so I recount all of that to say that that educational background equips me to teach across a wide range of disciplines. So it's come in handy. I'm a very interdisciplinary person and mind, and so right now, at Hofstra, Iona, and St. Paul's School of Nursing, I am teaching courses in criminology, in ethics, in sociology, in white collar crime, in college success, and sex and gender roles. I'm also going to be teaching social problems and introduction to sociology. So. Um, Across all of my courses, the main theme is power and reframing assumptions, right? And what do I mean by this, right? Something that I always say is that even though I teach a lot of courses, I'm actually not in the business of teaching. I am in the business of getting people to confront their own minds and to reframe how they think. And so what this looks like is, playing opposing counsel with my students, right? And offering them all different kinds of perspectives than their own. So instead of developing a theory for the case, as we would call it, right? In trials, I'm rather developing a case for the theories that we learn in class. And so just getting them to unpack their assumptions, like, okay, do we think that this theory, offered by Durkheim or Derrida or Foucault, do we think that this holds up in everyday life? And if so, why do we think so? And if not, why do we think this? And are there other angles from which we could attack this perspective? And what do you think? What do you think of yourself? What do you think of the broader world beyond you? And in doing so, I'm trying to get students to partake in the exercise of never assuming that their thoughts are foolproof, right? That the first step to gaining critical thought is to understand that you don't know everything, right? Knowing that you don't know everything. So you should always ask questions, right? You should always search for all of the facts, right, behind a scenario. You should always search for more information. You should always sit down with yourself and reflect, right, about your own positionality. And so the reason why I'm doing this is so that my students have a critical thought that is so strong that they are then prepared to head out into the world and approach any kind of situation that comes before them, whether it's in the job market, whether it's interpersonally, whether it's professionally. So, it's no surprise when I'm thinking about it that my courses somewhat end up becoming professional development sessions, right? On how to apply this critical thought that we're learning in class, whether it's in sociology, in criminology, to the broader world before them. Because again, there's a difference between knowledge and knowing. You can have a lot of knowledge and know nothing, right?
That's so true. I agree with that.
Right? And that's not the fate that I want for my students. So I feed them the knowledge, and then I ask them to interrogate the heck out of that knowledge, just so that they can learn to replicate that same process with any piece of information that they come across, right? And so that they are prepared as young adults.
Yeah, absolutely. And building off the concept of having a lot of knowledge and knowing nothing, I'm going to steal that from you, and I'll give you royalty checks every time I use it. I know, but I'm joking. But seriously, I want to know your opinion on this because a week ago at this time, Christine, we were celebrating the International Day for Persons with Disabilities, and as you know, I have cerebral palsy, and I advocate for the full inclusion for folks with disabilities in the workplace. And I don't have to tell you that the employment rate for folks with disabilities is a lot lower than those without disabilities. So from a legal perspective, I'm curious to get your definition of inclusion and how we eliminate barriers to inclusion for folks with disabilities in employment and society as well, my friend. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, no, and thank you for sharing this, Kevin. I mean, yeah, it is so important that we include those with disabilities, or neurodivergent thinking. I don't even like calling it neurodivergent thinking or a disability. I would like to say it's a different ability, right? Just have a different ability. And once again, I think a lot of these things start before we can, change things on a structural level. We have to be able to change things on a personal level, right? And I think people possess a lot of insecurities, right? Once again, people are not comfortable addressing perhaps their own prejudices, their own, limitations in terms of being open-minded. And when you're unable, to be open and to accept other people, to accept differences, you end up committing the act of, homogenization, right? And what that ultimately means is you're prioritizing your comfort over, the importance of including other people to have a very eclectic environment that is full of pluralities that enable everybody to succeed, right? So people often default to well, if this makes me uncomfortable, I just, I'm either going to treat you like you're not different from me, right? Or I'm going to design an environment where everyone is exactly like me. And I think that stifles learning. I think that stifles exposure to different kinds of lived experiences. And so for those with disabilities, no less, right? Once we accept that, again, having a disability, yes, might make life harder, but it should not be, it should not preclude one's ability to succeed in life and to offer insights and very rich insights that, the average able-bodied person might not have recognized. And so once we start addressing this on a personal level, then on a structural level, we have to say, well, okay, let's look around us. What does everyone look like? Where does everyone come from? And if you are seeing that, okay, there's very few people who have different abilities, right, then maybe it's time to include them in the room, right? But one thing that I always say is, to be honest with you, Kevin, and the reason why I actually respect you so much is I am more so a proponent of building your own table than asking for a seat at the table. And I think that inclusion involves asking the stakeholders of that table to, how do I put this? To find God, right? And you're having to sell them on why it's good to be inclusive. And what that does, in my opinion, is once again, assign power, delegate power that the same person asking to be included already has. And so, you didn't let your disability prevent you from starting your own podcast and creating awareness, right? And that is a very difficult thing to do, just in general, like, disability or no disability, that is hard to do. But you found it in yourself to say, you know what, I'm not letting this stop me, right? And so what if it makes my life harder? I am still going to live my life the way I want to live it. And that takes a lot of power, personal power, and a lot of willpower. And so I think for those who are wanting to find inclusion, and for companies who, should take on more of an inclusive mentality, I think it really starts with saying, well, what kind of environment do I want for myself? And do I want to win, right? A company that wants to win is going to invite everyone to the table who is capable of doing a good job, right? And capable of attacking blind spots that it might not otherwise have had, or otherwise have recognized, rather, right? But that's if you're secure and you want to win and you're not afraid of having talent and having people who are better than you and smarter than you, right? But if you're insecure, you're going to look and say, well, I don't want people at my table because, I'm the smartest person in the room, and I want to concentrate power, without recognizing that actually power in a lot of ways looks like being secure with yourself and knowing that everything is an opportunity. You just have to know how to make the best of it. So yeah, this is ultimately my position on the matter. People, the individual, right? On an individual level, people should always seek to create their own table. Of course, I understand that not everyone, has the resources or even just the mindset to make that happen. But I am a firm believer that it starts there. Like, screw asking for permission, right? Screw asking for recognition. I'm sorry, right? Recognize yourself. Why should you have people, tell you what you are capable of doing and not capable of doing, right? Mm-hmm. Why should you have people tell you who you are? Absolutely not. That's the first way you give up power. Rather, if you understand that your own recognition, right, and your own approval is what matters most, you are further ahead than many people. And so that's just my thought on the matter.
Well, I tell you, we can create a whole virtual course from that one answer. No, but I appreciate your dialogue on the matter, and I think more employers have to, I was having this conversation this morning, that more employers have to get out of the mindset of how much this is going to upfront cost me versus how much money this is going to save me if I do it on the front end, because we both get economic security in the back end of it and innovation as well. Well, would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm glad that you introduce, the economic considerations of this, right? Because unfortunately, even in education, all of these institutions are businesses, right? Mm-hmm. There's a bottom line to meet, right? And you have to sort of attend to market demands. And so I think, you know, a lazy way of doing it is like, if we don't have to answer for this, then we won't, right? With changing laws that say that overturn affirmative action or that overturn, the necessity to be inclusive, right? I think people have adopted the mentality like, okay, well, if it's no longer beneficial to our bottom line, why do we need it anymore? And I think having been in corporate law, I can understand that mentality. However, now being a professor, I would say that it is still possible to do good. It is still possible, to make sure that you meet your bottom line while still creating a space for everyone, to have a seat, to express their talents, in an equitable fashion. If you're only obsessed with the bottom line, I think you're more likely to be destitute than if you ensure that your bottom line includes generosity and advancing human agency and betterment. It's something that I think about all the time with the Elizabeth Chinabua Foundation, right? I'm sitting here and thinking about, okay, how do we develop the next model of higher education when so many different universities are collapsing and so many different educational departments are collapsing, right? The social sciences and humanities, they're no longer viable economically because they don't return, the promised return on investment. It's a shame because those subject areas are incredibly important. But here's how I work it out, right? As I'm developing curriculum, as I'm designing, our 5 to 10 year plan, I say, okay, if the market is saying that most people are no longer seeing the benefit of, a university education, because once again, it is not yielding a high ROI, right? People are flocking to the trades at the moment. Then what's the point? I say, okay, let's make this next model integrative, right? Let's meet market demands and let's also find a way to preserve, the importance of history, of sociology, of anthropology, right? And I could say, okay, we're going to make this integrative. Instead, we're going to make this very interdisciplinary. So instead of having standalone departments of only sociology or political science or American studies, we will combine this with maybe courses in the trades, right? Courses in AI and technology, in finance, in entrepreneurship, in adulting, right? How to take care of oneself. And so that would look like a course called the sociology of plumbing or the anthropology of nursing, right? And so that nothing is lost, right? But we are still adapting to an ever-changing environment.
Well, we can also call it the sociology of common sense, too, right?
Oh my goodness. That's really good.
And if you use that, I won't even ask for a commission check, I promise.
Oh, thank you, Kevin, because I was going to say, so whose intellectual property is this? Can I borrow it? Do you sign away your rights? No.
Yeah. And Christine, I know that for you, defending sort of the highest level of human value is essential to your sort of mission as a lawyer. So I'm curious about your definition of defending the highest sort of rate of potential of human beings and how understanding our legal rights and thinking can give us our own power. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I believe to my core is that the essence of being a lawyer, right, is defending the highest potential in other people. I'm not in a courtroom, but I am in a classroom. I do exist in the world. I commute. I take the train. I walk in the streets, and so every time that I have the opportunity to share light in somebody else's day, I will do so. If that looks like, just smiling at somebody, right? Or telling them that they look great or saying that they are an amazing person, I will do it. I do it all the time with my students by encouraging them to never doubt their own potential, right? And one thing I like to say, like, listen, there are people in power who are more mediocre than you are, right? Who do not have the minds that you do. You have no excuse not to succeed. If it's possible for them, it is possible for you too, right? And the reason why I'm so adamant about defending people's potential is because the only way that we can have change in the world is if we start by changing people's mindsets, right? This is why teaching is so important to me. You can't affect change if it doesn't start at home, if it doesn't start from within, and if it doesn't start with changing how you think, right? And so the more that I speak words of empowerment and wisdom into people, right, in such a manner that they begin to believe it about themselves, the more likely they are to then live a life that is empowered and fulfilled and aligned. And where does, legal thinking come into play here? I will give specific examples of this. For me in my own life, legal thinking has helped me navigate so many different situations, just so many different situations. Law school really does change the way you think, right? But I think it starts with equipping you with the confidence to know that if you really want to, you can have things your way, as long as you make a compelling argument for it, as long as you develop a repository of facts, of evidence, and not just sit with that evidence, but also develop the circumstantial evidence around that. That's even more important. And so it teaches you to be a really important advocate for yourself and for other people, right? And once again, I apply, the legal principles of contractual law, business law, criminal law, just everyday encounters with life. Like, so if somebody harms me, for instance, right, what was their intent? What was their impact, right? Did I sustain damages, right? Is it enough to make a case for soliciting recourse, right? Because here's the thing, a lot of people think that intent is the only thing that matters. It's not. Your actions also matter, right? So even if you did not intend harm, if you did not intend for a certain outcome, you still had an impact, right? Your actions still affected somebody. They still harmed somebody. They still produced a different outcome for someone. So the idea of being intentional, right? The idea of being intentional is incredibly important, because when you are intentional over your mind and what you intend to do, then you're also intentional over your actions, and you're better able to mitigate harm, and you're better able to be directional about the kinds of outcomes you'd like to see in the world. So torts law and criminal law are very helpful for thinking in this kind of way. So instead of rearing people to be aimless, right, with their intent, we are rearing people to be intentional with their own minds and their own actions, so that, again, they lead lives that are purposeful.
Yeah, absolutely. And what is your perspective on modern masculinity and really how we define that in today's age? Because men can often confuse their identity with I have to be the strength in a relationship. I have to fill a certain role. But you say there's a new way that we can talk about a modern masculinity. And I also wanted to ask you about mens rea and how we use legal reasoning and thinking to guide men towards a better sense of clarity. What are your thoughts there, my friend?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that the Elizabeth Chinabua Foundation is actively working on right now is our division of masculinity studies called mens rea, right? And I couldn't resist calling it mens rea. That's the lawyer in me, the criminal defense lawyer in me coming out. So to provide context for mens rea, in criminal law, right, in order for criminal liability to attach, you need four elements. You need the mens rea, right, the mental state. You need the actus reus, the voluntary act. You need causation and concurrence. So causation is the actual and proximate cause, right, behind the mental state and the actus reus, the voluntary act, and it needs to happen at the same time. But essentially, so mens rea, the mental state, one of the principles around that is that we do not judge people for their thoughts alone, right? So we can't convict somebody just for having bad thoughts, right? If they didn't act on those thoughts, then we have nothing to prosecute, to litigate, right? And the reason why I like that principle so much is because it removes judgment, right? So if we don't punish guilty thoughts alone, then it allows us to sit and accept that we have all kinds of thoughts. So with mens rea, for men in particular, and for masculinity in particular, we've tweaked the spelling, right? The original spelling, in Latin is MENSREA, right? But we've tweaked the spelling and we've spelt it MEN''S REA, so that it reads as men's, right? Like for men, rea, right? But our ultimate goal here is we want to give men a space and an opportunity and a path forward to share openly, to challenge traditional discourses on masculinity. We are trying to disassemble the discourse on toxic masculinity, right? By offering that men themselves are not toxic. I think what has happened with this discourse is that we are conflating toxicity with masculinity itself, and we need to be very accurate. We need to be precise here. So, from a sociological lens, right, if you are seeing a lot of men struggle in droves, right, this is a symptom of the broader society. It's not necessarily an issue with men themselves, although men are struggling, so that is an issue. But it's one of the broader society. And the analogy that I love to use here is that, if a plant is withering, right, if it's dying, withering, is the plant ill or is its environment ill, right? Is it not receiving enough water? Is it not receiving enough sunlight? That means that there is a deficit in the environment itself, and we need to attend to that deficit. And the same thing can be analogized with men. If men are struggling, right, with high suicide rates, with feeling a loss of purpose, with feeling like they don't have meaningful relationships, then we have to begin interrogating what kinds of scripts, right, social scripts, performances that we have prescribed to men to follow around masculinity. Because I think a lot of people make the mistake that men have power, right? A lot of people assume that men have power, men are powerful. I would actually contend that men have what is called the veil of power, right? So they have assigned power. And that is not the same as actual power, right? Express power. It's implied power. It's not the same thing. So when we pierce this veil, right, what we see underneath the veil is that a lot of men are breaking from that assigned power. And if somebody is breaking from the weight of assigned power, that means they don't actually have power. They're struggling. And they're struggling to make sense of it. They're struggling to have it align with who they are. So with mens rea, what we offer currently, I mean, I did a bit of market research and tried discovering what it is men are looking for when I asked, a few peers the kinds of courses they would take if they were no longer in undergrad or grad school, it became clear to me that men want to know how to be attractive, right? How to have better relationships, how to understand women. I asked them, would you take a course called Power in the Masculine? They said no. Would you take a course called How to Get Away with Real Love? They said absolutely not. And so, through more conversation, it became apparent to me, oh, I see. The need for relationships is a very real need. And so, okay, we're going to meet men where they're at. I mean, ultimately, the goal is to help men find their power and purpose, right? But, if they want to understand women better, if they want to know how to have successful relationships, I'm happy to teach them that, right, as a start, but it doesn't end there. And so the goal is to leave men feeling like they have value, they have purpose, they have, things to offer to this life and to broader society. And why do I care about this as a woman? Right? I care about this because I fundamentally believe that addressing what is going on with men is addressing what is going on with women. Mm-hmm. Right? This is not an issue that exists in a vacuum, and here's why. Women want relationships with men and men want relationships with women. And so as long as that exists, we have to develop the space for deeper understanding. And I don't just mean understanding flippantly. I mean taking off our own lenses, right? Taking a step back from our own positionality and actually hearing what the other person, in this case, men, what they have to say. And, criminal law, having worked in it, it really help me to remove judgment, because you hear all sorts of things, right? And one thing that we say in criminal defense is that there's no such thing as a good person or a bad person, right? The only difference between a good person or a bad person is a bad day. So instead of moralizing thoughts, instead of moralizing behaviors, mens rea is ultimately serving to provide a space where men can actually sit with their thoughts, their life, and say, you know what, I have value too. I have purpose too. Women should care about this because no one ever talks about the children that are brought into the equation, right? From relationships. And that matters because, once again, on a sociological level, if we don't fundamentally change our dynamic with each other, right, and our struggles, and we get together and procreate, on a sociobiological level, we are producing fruit of poisonous trees. If the tree is already poisoned, then the fruit is going to be poisoned. And the fruit in this case is the children. And we need to care about the children so that we're not fostering another generation that repeats the same detrimental cycles. So, yes, we have to start paying attention to what is going on with men. We have to start seeing and appreciating the humanity of men beyond their use value, right? And beyond scripts of masculinity that say you're only valuable if you make X, Y, Z salary per year, right? You're only valuable if you can produce. You're only valuable if you can, sacrifice your life. That's a miserable existence. And I think what we have done is that we have overcorrected in a sense. We move from toxic masculinity to overcorrecting toward, yes, healthy masculinities, but who is that healthy masculinity being embodied after, right? Is it being embodied after men themselves? Or are we saying without doing deeper interrogation that, oh, it's great to have empathy and emotional intelligence. That's just the natural standard and it's good. And it's like, yes, as a woman, I believe those things are amazing to have. But we can't start there. We actually have to start with men themselves and ask, well, what does masculinity actually look like for you? Because if you trained a generation of men to be stoic, right, and to associate being vulnerable with weakness and exposing themselves to danger, which is a very real fear and exposure, I don't think it helps to say, oh, just be more communicative or just be more vulnerable, right? We have to really take into account these differences in sociological conditioning and just actual biological nature, and sit with men and say, what do you want? What does this look like for you? So that we are meeting you where you are and so that you can best succeed, rather than telling you you're toxic, you have power, so what are you complaining about, right? It starts with deeper and actual listening.
Yeah, that leads to my next two questions, and I'm going to combine them because they're interconnected. And I'm interested to return to the concept of achieving inner clarity, because I know it's something that you're passionate about, and it's something that I think more people need to take the lens from a broader perspective of how identity shapes the pressure and expectations that we all encounter. So, how do you think inner clarity and the pressure and expectations that we face as a society are interconnected? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question because we fundamentally are social beings, right? We are very social beings. So naturally, we are going to look toward others to mirror us and to serve as barometers as to whether we're being socialized effectively, right? And so that inclines us to look for approval. But what happens is that when you start seeking the approval of other people, right, or the opinions of other people, you move further and further away from your own inner clarity and knowing, right? It is important once again to establish relationships in society. I get that. But I also think in order to establish effective relationships with other people, you have to establish an effective relationship with yourself. And so sometimes that means removing any entities, any people, any distractions that are pulling you away from listening to your inner voice and listening to your instinctual knowledge. I think in the West, we are very attached to knowledge for the sake of it, right? There's so many different types of knowing, and instinctual knowledge we have to start paying attention to and listening to. And so once you sit down and start listening to what your inner voice is telling you and is tugging on you for, you begin to ask yourself, well, is this the life that I want to live? Is this, the profession that I want to be in? Are these the people who uplift me and support me and help me achieve greater advancement? Or am I encumbered with narratives that look nothing like me, right? And sound nothing like me, right? And so you have to get comfortable really listening to yourself and trusting on some level that you know best about who you are, right? You are your own author, right? You are the own narrator of your life. Nobody is going to know you better than you know you. And so you have to be willing to bet on your inner voice and trust it. And yes, it involves sacrifice. It means removing the flashy opportunities. It means removing, friendships that are no longer working for you, romantic relationships that are no longer working for you, right? And that's not easy to do, but once you do it, it becomes easier and easier to start actually being who you are. And I can attest to that because I've gone through that process myself, right? I used to be in big law. I could have sat there and said, I'm going to continue doing big law for the rest of my life because it's prestigious. It gives me financial security, and I'm making $250,000 per year. And it's like, yes, I get to be, called a lawyer who's practicing in Midtown Manhattan, the financial center of the world, or I could sit and listen and say, well, actually, what moves me and what lights me up is empowering other people. Teaching gives me the best vehicle to do this. And, I could sit and lament that I forewent the path of least resistance, right? It was right there for me. Or I could sit there and say, actually, I would have been miserable, right? And this would not have made me happy in the long term. And I've made the sacrifice now so that I can have my version, my vision of success and happiness in the short, in the long term. So I'm sacrificing short-term discomfort, right, for long-term well-being. And yeah, I've removed quite a few relationships from my life that weren't supporting that. I obviously walked away from a profession that, for all intents and purposes, taught me a lot, but wasn't really who I was. Yeah, but I'm happier, Kevin. I'm happier now. And I feel more aligned. And so I encourage other people to really trust themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And just very quickly, I'll share a bit about my own personal employment journey. So when I graduated college, I went on 10 consecutive job interviews. And I was rejected 10 consecutive times because of my disability. In fact, one of the reasons I feel that I was sort of employment challenged, for the lack of a better term, is at the time when I graduated. So I graduated college in 2010, and my college struggled to find me an internship placement at the time because no newsroom would take me on as an intern because they didn't want to divulge the resources that would have taken to support me. So what happened out of college for me is it took me, so I graduated college when I was 22, and I got my first paying job when I was 28 years old. And it actually had nothing to do with journalism. It had to do for advocating for folks with disabilities and getting them employed, ironically. And I'm curious to talk to you about legal, resilience and what it means to be legally resilient and savvy. What do you think that means, my friend?
Yes, yes. I mean, to be legally resilient, ultimately, what comes to my mind is to not count yourself out before the case is tried, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Right? If you are really savvy and you're paying attention, I'm sure you really could win at any case, because being legally resilient means being an advocate for yourself no matter what. So even when a situation presents like it's impossible, you have to be willing to say it's possible for me. Right? It's possible for me, and here's why I'm going to win. And that means understanding the situation, right? The case disposition so well that you understand the facts beneath the facts, you understand the laws, you understand, different rules, because you need to understand not only the rules of life, you need to understand exceptions to the rules of life. And so it would be malpractice, right? If you didn't say to yourself, okay, these are all the facts that have been uncovered, and they're not working in my favor. It looks like I'm going to lose, but there has to be another way. There always is another way, right? So in order to be legally resilient, you really need to tell yourself you're going to win. Because even if the facts are not in my favor, the rules might be in my favor. And if the rules are not in my favor, maybe the jury might be in my favor. So I need to manipulate the jury. Did I just say manipulate? I meant persuade. I meant persuade the jury, right? I need to make my story so compelling that they have no choice but to rule in my favor. And that's I'm using, trial strategy here, but I'm ultimately talking about life strategy, right? And so never letting your circumstances prevent you from winning. Yeah, you might not have the most glorified facts available to you. You might not have the best situation available to you, but you do have other cards that you can play, right? You have so many other cards and you have to be able to look for them, right? There are people who've gotten away with murder because they were able to make a jury cry. One of the examples that I love to use with my students, right, whenever we're learning criminal law principles and the difference between law and justice, right? I use one of them as an example, and I'm saying, hey, you, let's say Johnny, right? Johnny, you hit Sally, right? You went and you assaulted Sally, and everyone in this room saw you do so, right? And so if I were defending you in a courtroom, right, before a jury of your peers, what I would try and do is to get everyone to think otherwise. So I would actually say, no, you didn't see Johnny hit Sally. You saw Johnny's father hitting Johnny. And the real defendant in the courtroom today is not Johnny, it's his father. And so now what you're doing is shifting the mind of the jury toward a different perpetrator rather than the actual perpetrator, right? So I offer this analogy, I offer this example to say, you have to work with what you have and you have to be able to spin it to your favor. So that is ultimately what it means to be legally resilient.
Yeah, and Christian, I've got two questions left for you. And the first is because I'm curious and fascinated to get your answer. I'm not asking you to divulge your political leanings in any way, but what I wanted to know was the impact that you believe that President Trump has had on the legal system. He got the Supreme Court to allow him to have presidential immunity, something we've never seen before. He's used the Supreme Court in his favor more than any other president in history, and all you have to do is look at the objective data to make that argument, and I'm willing to have that argument with whoever wants to have it. But I wanted to know your fundamental thoughts on how his two presidencies now have fundamentally changed the American legal system because with his influence, it'll never be the same. And I'm curious to see the way that you view it as well, my friend. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think the legal system and the legal profession at large is at an inflection point. And, you know, in terms of Trump's presidency, it's serving as a catalyst, right? Whether you like it or not, for certain reforms, certain changes that are likely needed, right? And so I think it's exposing a lot of what has not been working, right? I mean, when we think about the rule of law, this goes back to what I said earlier. Whose rule of law, right? Who is the rule of law for? And of course, people would think it's for everyone. Yes, as an ideal, it is, but in practice, is it? And I can say, having observed the way that a lot of big corporate law firms responded, to to a lot of Trump's decisions with respect
And
to
universities.
and universities, right? Of course, right? And universities with the way they responded, what it revealed to me is that once again, and I have to be careful, with saying this, but maybe the rule of law is only as deep as the rule of law is only as deep as the pockets of its stakeholders, right? Um, if a lot of universities and corporate law firms were capitulating, to these threats, and if the people working for these universities and corporate law firms did not take it upon themselves to say, actually, we're going to do something about this, right? Because to my knowledge, a lot of people are still employed with these universities and corporate law firms. They didn't leave them. Then I don't necessarily know that the problem is Trump's presidency so much as it is us as a society. Because what his presidency has revealed is that we are really afraid as a people. And it's nice to talk about morals and values, but if we're not backing up the morals and values that we claim to have, what good is it? It's like, legislating a piece of law and never enforcing it. The law practically doesn't exist. And I think one takeaway that we should have had, from that moment is that are we really willing to defend our laws in a manner that protects us if it's not protecting our paychecks first? And I keep on pointing to the paychecks and to the dollars because we are such a capitalistic society.
Mm-hmm.
And so are we a nation of laws or are we a nation of dollars?
Well, we could have posed that question on January 6th, 2021, my friend. But anyway.
Right. Oh, well. And I say all of this to say that maybe our laws are incredibly fragile.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing upholding them is this illusion of safety and peace and democracy. But when push comes to shove, we have shown that maybe we're not willing to do anything it takes to defend those laws. And that is why, it's easy to point to Trump and say, oh, he's causing all of this upheaval and destruction. Sure. But is it him alone? I mean, how did this man get in office, right?
Society put him there first.
Society put him there, right? We can blame him all we want, or we can take a hard look in the mirror, right? This is what I'm always saying. It's easier to point to other people, right? And look at them and look at what they're doing. But what are we doing? Mm-hmm. What are we doing for ourselves? So again, I honestly have no political affiliation one way or the other. I'm more interested in examining things from the lens of power using socio-legal analysis. And from what I see, right, with President Trump, he's somebody who knows the language of power. Like he is. He doesn't. Nothing is stopping that man. And we can sit there and say, oh, it's terrible, what he's doing is bad. Of course. Like so many arguments can be made for that. Or we can sit there and say, at the end of the day, that man is embodying power. So then moving forward, what do we want our power to look like? Mm-hmm. It's easier to complain, right? It's less easy to do something about our complaints. And I'm really in the camp of, well, what are we going to do about it? If we're not willing to do anything about it, then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that sparked so many other questions, but we've had a wholesome discussion about the law and its impact on society. And as we wrap up our time together today, Christine, I'm curious to ask you about your own professional and personal legacy and how you want that to be defined in your life and the work that you do today, my friend. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at this point in time, right, I want my legacy to be one of leaving lasting change within people, right? And I'm ultimately trying to show a different way of lawyering, right? I am saying that and demonstrating that lawyering, being a lawyer, can look like uplifting human beings. That is a form of practice, right? To whom much is given, much is expected. And I see my legal education, as a profound opportunity and benefit that I've been given that I want to make good use of. And so by humanizing people, I feel like I, as a lawyer, am humanizing the law itself, right? And demonstrating that other people can come and join in and partake in that form as well, right? I really want to move away from this idea that lawyering just looks like practicing in a courtroom, right? Practicing traditional law. I think a lot of the disconnect that people, right, the average citizen, the citizenry, is feeling between themselves and the law is that they feel like it doesn't speak to them, right? That they have no business with it, or that they are excluded from it. And I'm trying to give the language of, no, this is for you. This is also yours, right? The law is humanistic. You can use its thinking, you can use its language to spearhead your own autonomy, right? And this is what it means to practice law differently by offering people a new language for their sense of self, right? And equipping them with the ability to say that anything is possible. That is what it looks like for me to defend their highest potential.
Yeah, absolutely, my friend. And finally, tell me, if people want to get connected with you, what's the best way they can do that?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So in order to connect with me, I mean, I'm available on LinkedIn, right, at Christina Ohenewah, but they can also visit my foundation's website, www.etfny.org. And, they can check out what we have going on. And, we have our email listed, contact forms listed. So they absolutely can visit that page again, or just get in touch with me personally. I'm open to that.
Well, fantastic, my friend. I have to tell you, this is one of the more extensive and thought-provoking conversations that I've had in a while. I have to tell you, my friend, I'm closing in on 1,500 episodes on this podcast, and this will certainly be in my top 10 of my favorites, my friend. So I want to thank you for bringing your A game to our conversation, and it was delightful to engage in conversation with you this afternoon. Thank you so very much for being here, my friend.
Kevin, thank you. I cannot thank you enough for having me on your platform. Again, like I said, I'm in deep admiration of you and the work that you are doing. And again, your words are very kind and they mean a lot. So thanks for helping support it.